Capstone presentations. I am David B. Miller, the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs, Student Services, and Chair of the MSW program here at the Mandel School. I want to offer my greetings from Dean Boisson, who could not be here this evening. He is traveling, but he wanted to congratulate the fellows for their outstanding work and welcome all the guests who are in attendance this evening. It is my honor today to kick off such an intriguing series of presentations. The Leadership Fellows program at the Mandel School is designed for exceptionally qualified, highly motivated students who are interested in leadership, best practice approaches to human service delivery and community practice, and making a positive influence in the world. Our Leadership Fellows this year have been working so hard to gather and prepare their information to share with you today. To tell you a little more about the exciting research and work of these fellows, I would like to pass it off to Dr. David Hussey. And once again, thank you all for being here with us today to celebrate the achievements of the Mandel School Leadership Fellows. Let's give them a big round of applause. David.
Thank you, Dean Miller. And thank you for that warm welcome. I'd also like to extend a special welcome to our new and former fellows and their families, to our mentors, and to all our students who are able to join us. The capstone presentations are the culminating learning experience of the Mandel Leadership Fellows program. Using an evidence-based lens, the fellows examine compelling practice issues and typically propose creative innovations and advancements. Listen carefully tonight because you might be introduced to some new terms and concepts. Third spaces, 1.5 Gen youth, and anosognosia. Our fellows are representative of all our students, and these 8 capstone projects magnificently illustrate the depth and breadth of social work practice and the early grasp our students have on both practice challenges and the potential solutions to highly complex issues. The capstone projects are typically completed over the course of one semester and often conducted in concert with the help of our faculty, field supervisors, and Mandel Leadership Fellow mentors. There are 2 components to this evening's session. First, a brief 6-minute live stream series of presentations, and then we transition to a traditional poster session where attendees get to discuss and ask questions of the fellows. In the chat, you'll see contact information for our fellows. Feel free to send them questions or comments that they could respond to after the session, but probably not tonight, maybe tomorrow, perhaps the day after. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our first presenter, Jackie Serta.
Hi everyone, my name is Jackie, and today I'll be talking to you a little bit about family-based interventions that target suicidality in transgender adolescents. So first, I would like to start off by making sure that we all have the same language. Sex and gender are... I can't hear you, ma'am. Can you get closer to the mic? Is this better? Sorry. Cool. I want to make sure that we all understand what I mean by transgender. So first and foremost, sex and gender are often linked together, but they're 2 separate things, right? So sex is the biological component of an individual, including the reproductive system, hormones, and sex chromosomes, whereas gender is a social construct. We can see that in the way that society deems or separates into a binary man and woman, and how we're supposed to act according to those gender identities, and what's an appropriate way to express ourselves in those identities. Transgender individuals are individuals who identify with a different gender identity than the one that they were assigned to at birth. One of the reasons why this population interested me was that this year was my first internship where I got to dip my toe into practicing therapy. And as luck would have it, one of my very first clients was a young transgender adolescent who had an extensive history of suicidality and had had multiple suicide attempts. To be quite honest, I was in over my head with this client. So that client did get transferred over to a clinician who had a lot more experience with that population. But just because that client got transferred over didn't mean that I stopped thinking about this population or the issues that target them. So I did a literature review on existing interventions for this population, and I'd like to share with you a little bit about what I learned. In the United States, approximately 1.6 million individuals are transgender. Of that population, 1 in 5 are adolescents between the ages of 13 and 17 years old. Transgender individuals across the globe face higher rates of adverse health outcomes due to systemic, social, and economic marginalization. And it is due to this marginalization that 82% of transgender individuals have considered suicide. Studies have also suggested that upwards of 40% of these individuals considered or attempted suicide during their adolescent years. So you can see why it's an important topic to research. I look specifically into family-based interventions because research has demonstrated that the largest predictor for suicidality in transgender adolescents is family rejection. Conversely, family support leads to positive mental health outcomes and a decrease in risk behaviors and self-harm. The issue, however, is that the more that I looked into family-based research, or research for family-based interventions, the more that I found out that there just simply is not enough. To this date, there is no evidence-based intervention for this population, which is a shame because data has shown that rates of anxiety and suicidal depression amongst this population can be similar to their cisgender counterparts if they feel socially supported by their parents. But how do we get there? Well, there's current practice guidelines and recommendations have overall moved from pathologizing transgender identities to affirming their identities, which is a wonderful start. And there's commonly proposed interventions that utilize the gender minority stress model to guide those adaptations. According to the model, the stress factors that lead to poor health outcomes include gender-based discrimination, rejection, victimization, and non-affirmation, while some of the resiliency factors are community connectedness and pride. Most of these suggested interventions for these populations focuses on decreasing those stress factors and increasing resiliency by supporting the individual, increasing family attachment and empathy amongst family members, assessing and modifying gender expectations and gender norms, and empowering families to get involved in both the community and advocacy and allyship. And while these adaptations to these interventions make sense and they follow the theoretical framework, none of them have been empirically reviewed. Ultimately, moving forward, we need more research in this area of study. While existing studies look promising, they are only on small groups or individual case studies. So we can look at the qualitative data, but none of them are capturing quantitative data, and none of them are experimental by design. So we can't relate causation with the interventions to the outcomes. Research needs to focus on expanding the experimental designs and quantitative outcome data to be able to link causation with the interventions that we're applying to this population with the outcomes we're hoping to get. We're also hoping, and I'm hoping, that future interventions will start to look a little more closely into incorporating BIPOC transgender adolescents' experiences. Research has shown a great dearth. They're just simply not capturing demographic information for people of color in this particularly vulnerable population. There is so much more that I'd like to chat with you about. So if you'd like to swing by my poster and chat with me a little bit and ask questions, I would love that. So it is with great honor and great happiness that I get to introduce my friend and colleague, Erin Grohe.
Hi, everybody. I'm Erin. So I'm a graduating And this is my poster. I'm a graduating MSW M&O dual degree student here, and I'm also employed part-time at CASA of Portage County. So CASA stands for Court Appointed Special Advocates Program, and that's the topic of my evidence-based practice research today. So a little bit of background, there are over 500,000 confirmed cases of child maltreatment annually in the United States. 1% of the US child population enters into family court each year. And of that percentage, roughly 60% of cases require removal from their parents, so the children are actively placed in foster care. So CASA, Court Appointed Special Advocates, is the intervention that I'm reviewing today. CASA was founded in 1976 by family court judge Dave Sokup in Seattle, Washington. He turned to community volunteers to assist in the jurist decision-making process. There's now 939 CASA programs across 49 of the states, all but North Dakota, as you can see in my little map here. Get on board, North Dakota. And there's nearly 100,000 volunteers serving over 200,000 children annually in the family court system. So the intervention itself, what is it? There's highly trained community volunteers. They have background checks and thorough screenings. They complete 30 hours of onboarding training and then 12 hours of ongoing training each calendar year. And those are actually big parts of my responsibility as a CASA volunteer coordinator. And then they're appointed to a child in the family court system. So that child had either experienced abuse or neglect. And we, as their staff members, support and guide them and supervise them throughout the duration of their case. So the CASA volunteers, as you can see, as these 5 boxes down here, predominantly learn, engage with the family, collaborate with other professionals, report to the court what's going on the case, and make recommendations as to the best interest of the child. So the theory of change here is that because CASAs are appointed in a one-to-one advocacy model, as you can see with my little fingers up there, it's generally one CASA to one family or one child, and they stay involved in the case throughout the entire roller coaster from start to finish the entire way through. It increases the amount of information that jurists are receiving in the courtroom. So there are additional questions about how that information increase in the courtroom would affect various outcomes, and that's predominantly what the research has really looked into. So my methods, because I'm employed at the CASA program, I had insider access, right? So I had a lot of experience and observations and also some cross-program collaborations to be able to support my research. But I also conducted a robust literature review into what the empirical base for this program is. And so in terms of the empirical evidence, there was a lot of research conducted in the 1990s, so about 15 years after the program had started, that showed that children assigned a CASA volunteer were more likely to achieve a number of positive outcomes. However, unfortunately, recently, there's been some more studies that have kind of undermined these positive findings, stating that there were methodological flaws, selection bias, or small sample sizes. And so we've kind of had to recreate this evidence support. And so a couple of additional studies, again, kind of on the negative side, have found that there's an increased number of placements for kids assigned a CASA volunteer, that family court cases are open longer, or sometimes children are more likely to be adopted than reunified. However, I would question whether these things are really some of the outcomes we should be looking at. If there's going to be an advocate one-to-one working with the family, it makes sense that it may take a little bit longer for the case to wrap up. So research within the past decade has shown some positive outcomes. That CASAs promote service completion. They also support academic and behavioral performance for children in school, and lasting change and permanent placements for children, and then effective interprofessional communication on cases, something that's really important. In 2021, National CASA conducted and commissioned a survey on jurist perspectives that showed that across the board, jurists had really positive reviews for CASA programs. And there are implementation barriers in place to rolling this out, right? So because it's a volunteer workforce, there are challenges with recruitment and retaining individuals in these roles. There's also questions about the conflicting empirical evidence and really a need for more randomized control studies, but unfortunately some ethics around whether that's something that we should be doing. And there's also a lot of variance in research because of the difference by state, county, and jurist utilization of the programs. It looks very different depending on what state and county you're in. So I do have a quote over here on the side that I'd like to read out. So Marianne Wright Elderman, she's the founder of the Children's Defense Fund, notes that CASA's commitment, vigilance, and persistence offer hope where there has been little. So I think this concept of hope is something that we should lean into in further research too, because yes, there is a lot of importance in achieving permanency in certain timelines in family court systems, but how are the children faring throughout that role in their case? So a couple of recommendations that I came to in terms of opportunities and the impact they may have. First, investing in supporting CASA staff, right? If these individuals are supporting a wide number of CASA volunteers, it can improve retention if the staff themselves feel important. Second, establishing CASA fidelity models. So a model that could then be compared to a non-fidelity model to see what are some of the uniform promotions of best practices that we can roll out. Third, partnership. So finding not only partnership for programmatic support, but also funding to be able to do further evaluations. And then number 4, collecting stakeholder feedback so that we can fine tune the program to see what exactly should be rolled out. So PASA programs, as you can see again in the model over on the right-hand side, they are a financially wise investment because 1 year of CASA advocacy costs less than 1 month of foster care placement. And so referring to, again, the little far graphic over there, one CASA staff member can support 30 CASA volunteers who can serve approximately 75 children. So this is compared to a guardian ad litem. A guardian ad litem in family court generally serves 30 or so children as opposed to the one-to-one model. They also get paid for their practice, right? The evaluation and implications. So some research implications, although it is a promising intervention with high face validity, it's not yet an evidence-based practice. So we really want to make sure there's a robust literature behind supporting this so we can further roll it out. And jurists have continued to value CASA programs. And they note that the main barrier to appointment is insufficient volunteers. Next, establishing fidelity is something that's really critical. Designing and implementing a CASA fidelity model and then comparing that to a low fidelity model would kind of circumvent some of these ethical concerns that we have for randomized control studies. And then lastly, collaborative partnerships, really knowing that the National Council for Juvenile and Family Court Judges is a key partner that we need to leverage in this work, not only in seeing what the impact is on judicial decision making, but also on the well-being and livelihood of children in the foster care system. So with that, I turn it over to my peer and friend, Grayson Holt.
All right. Hello, everyone. Oh, nice. That was easy. Good. So my presentation today is on some topics that I've been researching for a few years now, starting in undergrad, and they surround medication non-adherence, treatment disengagement, and the specific patient population of people with schizophrenia who are unaware of their illness. And so I'll start with some really good news, which is that today we have medications that for people with schizophrenia can treat many, not all, but many of their symptoms. The challenge is that it's hard to get people to take them. And so the average rate of non-adherence among people with schizophrenia is about 50%. And so that leads to a logical next question, which is, okay, well, what predicts who will and won't take medication? And so what I found was that the most common predictor of medication non-adherence was unawareness of illness, or anosognosia, as Dr. Hussey referred to. It's a neurocognitive deficit. It's a symptom of the disorder. It is not denial, but it is an aspect of the condition that prevents people from understanding that they are ill. And so that's a challenge, right? Because if someone doesn't understand they're ill, they're not going to want to take medications for that illness. And so what I wanted to research through this project was, well, what are some of the interventions to improve medication non-adherence among all people with schizophrenia? And then I've been researching the listen, empathize, agree, partner approach, which is it's an approach designed specifically for the characteristics of this population of people who have schizophrenia and are unaware of their illness to engage them in treatment. And I wanted to evaluate what the level of evidence was supporting this intervention. And so a bit about LEAP and the theory of change surrounding LEAP. So rather than winning on the logic of getting people into treatment through using psychoeducation, talking about their illness, pros, cons, medication, because someone's unaware of their illness, we take a different tactic, which is centering the relationship. And so the stronger we can create that relationship, the more likely we're able to engage people in treatment. And so I have a picture of a horse up there that I try to sneak into every presentation because I just love talking about this patient. So this was Amy, who had schizoaffective disorder, had no awareness of her illness despite a 30-year history of having symptoms that were pretty challenging for her, and they led to her being involuntarily hospitalized. That's where I met her as an aide on an inpatient civil psych unit. And so Amy and I for a long time did not get along because she didn't want to be there, and she saw me as keeping her there. But what I found after learning about this approach is listening to her and forming a relationship, and I'm happy after to talk more about the specific skills, but it centers the relationship, and a relationship centered on trust, on mutual understanding, and on what Amy's goals were. And she loved to paint, she loved to bake cookies, and she ended up, because we talked about those goals and how we could promote that, she actually gave me this horse before she was discharged. And so that's kind of the nature of this intervention. Is typically people have goals that their illness gets in the way of them accomplishing, and if we can partner on those goals, then engagement and treatment will likely be a part of that. But that's not the stated goal. It's not obvious that people want to take medications, whether they're aware or unaware of their illness. And so what I found first was that, in reference to this first question of what interventions are currently used, one, a therapeutic alliance characterized by partnership on goals and on that therapeutic relationship, on that trust and mutual respect, was associated with higher engagement and treatment. And then, and this was quite shocking to me, what I found was that psychoeducation, although very common in practice, was typically not effective in increasing adherence with medication. What was effective was behavioral interventions, so like problem solving, finding ways of rewarding medication adherence or practicing adherence. Those were effective. And then conversely, the other interventions that were effective were focused on the attitude. They were in alignment with motivational interviewing and eliciting the patient's own motivation for taking medication and what their attitude is towards medication, and partnering them with that attitude, not creating conflict there, but trying to understand that perspective. And so what I found in reference to LEAP was that, one, it's been manualized really well. So I have a cover there of Dr. Amador's book, who's the clinical psychologist that I researched this topic with. There's a train the trainer for LEAP, and they've sold 1.5 million copies of this book. The challenge is that I was surprised by this, it hasn't been researched very well. So there's one randomized controlled trial. The only comparison group was people receiving a Rogerian therapy, like a humanistic therapy. And the other finding was that there was this self-report fidelity measure that was developed, but I hadn't seen it applied in that randomized controlled trial. So some final takeaways for discussion is that in reference to strengths, LEAP is like really well known, has a lot of face validity. It would make sense that a better relationship, it would make sense that partnering with the patient's goals would lead to engagement and treatment. However, we haven't compared it to many other interventions. We haven't studied it in different settings of care, because people with schizophrenia can receive inpatient, outpatient, intensive outpatient, a variety of settings of care that we don't know if LEAP is a good fit for, because we haven't researched it. And so next steps will be conducting some of this research with more clinicians conducting LEAP and with more settings of care to get back to those relationships, because I think we all want to engage people and we all want to understand their experience, but it can be challenging, and I think LEAP gives a way to help us understand people's experience and join with it. And so with that, next up is Abby.
Oh, hold on. Well, hello. So I did my project on intergenerational community building. The idea behind this capstone was that I wanted to address a little bit of the social isolation epidemic that's rising in the United States right now. So we think about social isolation, we typically think about how it impacts seniors, how it impacts youth, especially after COVID when people were stuck inside for a while. But what we're also noticing is this is really impacting the middle generation, who can sometimes serve as caregivers for younger children or for their older parents. And so while this generation maybe at one point had really strong, it was common to know your neighbors, and you would have really strong social networks that you could fall back on if you lost your job or if your kid was sick or something was going on. These relationships have kind of been dwindling, which is having consequences not only for mental health, well-being, but also financial consequences. So I'm going into community social work, so social networks are really important to me. So something that I wanted to think about for this project was how we could come up with a program that would not only start to rebuild and normalize these social networks, but would also think about how we could create or set a precedent for more inclusive intergenerational community building, just like as a whole. So I decided to build off of an intervention that already exists, which is intergenerational programming. So this program addresses social isolation specifically for seniors and youth, which they call skipped generations. So this normally looks like some kind of facilitated activity. You've got seniors maybe coming into an elementary school, maybe are tutoring in an after-school program, and they're seeing really positive benefits for how this improves relationships between these two generations. It's improving well-being and emotional state, and they're also just getting to learn about each other in a way that they maybe wouldn't normally. But what we're also seeing is that these relationships really only last for the time that the program is happening. They're not able to continue past just because of transportation concerns or financial barriers. And then it also doesn't include the middle generation as participants, which if you're trying to do generationally inclusive community building, leaving out like 50% of the US population. So that's a problem. So what I wanted to think about for this project was not only adding in that middle bridge generation between the seniors and the youth, which they're calling working age adults, but also think about how we can make the facilitated activities more focused on asset mapping or an artistic version of asset mapping. So if you don't know what asset mapping is, this is a common tool used in community building where participants can come together and share strengths that they've identified about their communities. So for example, if we're thinking about asset mapping for relationship building, participants might say, oh, a strength is my local library because that's where I go for book club or that's where I meet my friends after school. And the idea is that community builders will then add on to these assets that have already been identified as useful rather than just coming up with some random program that might not work. So the idea behind having this whole combination is that one, the arts and asset mapping are going to be an inclusive, low barrier to entry opportunity for all participants, kind of across developmental stages or mobility. And then also will be empowering as everyone is invited to share their thoughts and opinions on what an inclusive community would look like. And then thinking about the middle generation, this not only adds another generational perspective and more opportunities for relationship building, but theoretically, the middle generation might have more access to flexible transportation, might have a more flexible schedule or finances that could help them kind of continue this relationship building after the program ends. So in order to test this, I did a literature review and then a few semi-structured interviews. And what I found was that asset mapping and arts programming already kind of have a precedent with intergenerational programming. If we think about asset mapping, the whole point is to empower all different types of participants. There's a really flexible facilitation style, and a lot of the best practices align really well with the best practices of intergenerational programs. And then if you're thinking about arts programming, we already see our art therapy that works from youth all the way up to seniors. And if you were one of the many people that picked up a creative hobby during COVID, you probably noticed how that made you feel. So not only is it an inclusive activity, but there also might be some added benefits beyond just like the relationship building that we're going for. So I was lucky enough to be able to talk to Dr. Burke, who is a researcher at Monash University in Australia. And she talked to me about how she did a combination arts and asset mapping project with youth and seniors. So they were able to get together and either draw or paint or take pictures of assets in their community. And what she found was that a lot of them identified really common assets. So they were able to build relationships just about what similarities they found and what they liked about their community. But they were also able to form relationships over just like what they were doing for art. So one youth and one senior were able to form a relationship about knitting, which had like no relationship to the program, but was a really awesome opportunity. So I think that just shows there's definitely some opportunities there for that combination. And then thinking about adding in the middle generation, there's not as much research about this for intergenerational programming, but we do notice that the middle generation is already showing up as volunteers and facilitators. So they are already getting some tangential benefits in that intergenerational programming, like just increased communication or just access to other perspectives. And additional research with Generations United, which is kind of a national intergenerational programming kind of not conglomerate, but so they said that what they had observed in intergenerational programs between college students and seniors was that the college students were able to continue the relationships after the program ended because they had more flexible transportation and just more flexible schedules in general. So there are some opportunities there as well, I think. So I definitely want to just be transparent. There's not a lot of research on this type of programming that includes all three elements. There would be like piecemeal or theories that would either talk about like a couple of those things or just one. So there's definitely a strong theoretical background. But as Dr. Hussey always says in class, more research is needed. So we definitely want to take a look at that. And then we also need to think about facilitation. We're combining a ton of different programs with a lot of different best practices, and there are so many different types of art that you could include. So thinking in the future not only about doing additional research on whether or not these relationships can actually last past the program, but also thinking how can we actually train the trainers or the program leaders and how to put this forward. So that being said, everybody that I talked to was like really excited about the possibility of intergenerational community building. That seems like that's becoming more of a trend. So I would love to leave you with a quote from Dr. Burke. She asked me to say this in an Australian accent because she's from Australia. I think I'm going to spare you all from that today. But she said that when people work across age groups, sparky things happen. And I just think that's a really fun way to think about the potential that this type of programming has for intergenerational community building. Oh, and I advanced it. Maybe too far. So up next is going to be Caroline Steichner.
Wow, you are tall. Can you hear me if I'm here? Is this okay? Great. Well, if Abby had very little research, then I have even less. I will start with that. But I am so excited to talk to you today about my capstone, which is exploring ways in which we could integrate therapy and mental health services into coffee shops. So a little bit of background. Mental Health America reported in 2023 that about 55% of adults with a mental illness receive no treatment. But even before that, I'd been really thinking about this idea of how to create a space that you could intentionally make people feel welcome and feel comfortable to ask for help, but that isn't a clinical space. So this idea really came about maybe 5 years ago. I started thinking about this when I started becoming a yoga teacher. As I became connected to the yoga community in Chicago, I found a space where discussion of mental health and preventative wellness practices were not only encouraged, but openly discussed. At a time when therapy wasn't a common practice, in the yoga studio, the announcement of starting therapy was met with enthusiastic applause. I became interested in the factors of starting therapy and the factors of this community space, and what was so successful in normalizing wellness practices in this space and in such a public way that isn't happening in other spaces. So around the same time, I was living in Chicago, and I started passing this pop-up coffee shop called Coffee, Hip Hop, and Mental Health. Has anyone seen it? No, okay. So on the outside of this building, in neon yellow fluorescent lights, it just says Coffee, Hip Hop, and Mental Health. And it was like upstairs of a Lululemon for about a month, and then it moved to some side street, and then to a storefront. It was all over Chicago, and it would disappear and then come back a few months later. So finally I walked in one day, and it was just a normal coffee shop. People sitting around having coffee with signage about mental health. They had information about therapy, but you could just sit there and do your work. I did a lot of work there, actually. But so with these two kind of ideas in my mind, when I came to this capstone and Dr. Hussey asked what I wanted to research, I said, how to do therapy in a coffee shop. And I began to design a proposal that targeted individuals who are not connected to therapy, but who may be open to receiving emotional support or talk therapy if the barriers to entry were lowered. The program that I'm going to propose intends to provide a space that is integrated into the community, where individuals can gather and work, but also take an active step toward maintaining their mental health. So for my research process, I conducted a comprehensive literature review. I did an interview with a social worker who's working currently in a co-located mental health program, and I did some observations of different programs that already exist. And like I mentioned earlier, I did not find a lot of research about therapy in coffee shops. Actually, I found almost none, and that coffee shop I mentioned did not want to talk to me. But I did find a lot of research that is connected and kind of related, and I kind of integrated those together for the proposal that I'm going to share. So the 4 areas that I really looked at were third spaces, which have been found to offer many health benefits, place-based interventions, so programs that are happening consistently in a space that isn't a clinical setting, so maybe in a park or a library, community center. They found that they were generally beneficial, but that it was hard to distinguish if it was the space or the social aspect that really was making that benefit. Then I looked at co-locating mental health services in community settings, so maybe AA in a church basement, a group session or a grief session in a yoga studio, things like that. They found that this was really beneficial to increase community trust, and it was really adaptable. You could understand the community, so you could make it really match what they needed. And finally, I looked into the non-clinical support spaces for individuals with severe mental illnesses. So programs like Magnolia House, like the Living Room in Chicago, programs where you can drop in and receive the care you want, but you're not required to be receiving care every time you walk through the doors. So with these kind of 4 areas, I wound up with this theory of change. By co-locating mental health services in everyday communal spaces, we could foster greater utilization by offering an option that is less stigmatizing, safer, and more easily accessible for individuals without established therapy resources. The community aspect of such interventions could further normalize seeking mental health treatments. So it's a little bit blurry, so if you want to understand the program design, come to my poster later. It is kind of described in more detail. But briefly, the 4 areas that I found to be really essential for this program to work would be a welcoming coffee shop environment that was really useful. So having Wi-Fi, having tables, having space for gathering, things like that that really bring people in. Mental health support, whether that's peer support, therapists, clinicians, psychoeducation groups, things of that nature. Resource navigation, so a strategy for figuring out if someone comes and participates in therapy once, what happens next? Can we connect them to other agencies? Do we have programs internally that we can connect them to? Things like that. And then intentional community. Personally, as a person who grew up doing yoga and before that doing dance, I think that community gathering is so essential for mental health. And so I think it would be really important and beneficial to offer mindfulness classes, book clubs, affinity groups, yoga, things like that. And I think that actually serves as a dual purpose because it would also give an opportunity for people who had participated to bring in their peers. If maybe they felt like a friend could use support, but they didn't want to come to therapy, maybe they would come to book club, maybe they would come to yoga class, and eventually feel comfortable in that space, and eventually be willing to maybe use the other services offered. So some of the barriers, and please come to my poster and tell me other barriers that you think. But some of the barriers that I've identified throughout this research are questions of privacy when you're offering mental health services in a community space, financial stability of the program. The coffee shop that I kept on popping by doesn't seem to be doing particularly well financially. The non-clinical environment and how to maintain it. So I think it's really important that you continue having community members come to this space just because it's a useful space and it doesn't turn into kind of a therapy place that happens to look like a coffee shop, but it really continues to offer those services for the community. And then how to prepare clinicians to best support individuals with the severe mental illnesses or with high-risk situations. So if it's a drop-in model, anyone can come in, everyone is welcome. What do we need to do to make sure that the clinicians and the peer supports who are offering those services are really prepared to do the best possible? Some opportunities that I think are really exciting about this idea are the popularization of holistic and wellness practices. Yoga's cool, yoga's popular, everybody likes to go to yoga, so how do we use that and maybe encourage them to not only go to yoga, but also seek therapy if they need it? I think that offering a community space like a coffee shop also has kind of another benefit in that people might be exposed to the mental health is cool, therapy is awesome, you should come to, even if they're there to work. Even if like my dad goes to a coffee shop to work every day, if he's seeing all this information, then maybe slowly those ideas kind of start to sink in. And then unfortunately, in my research about third space, it seems like in general there's kind of been a reduction of them. People aren't using libraries, community spaces as much as they used to be, so maybe a program in this area would really provide some opportunities there. So I'll leave you with this. I think that such a program with appropriate design could tap into growing interest in holistic medicine and wellness approaches. Instead of someone thinking, I don't need a therapist or I'm not crazy, we could begin to shift the narrative toward, it might be helpful for me to talk through this crazy situation with someone. And perhaps more importantly, I don't need to do this alone because I know where to go. I look forward to discussing this more with you at your poster. And next up, Valeria Stutz.
Hi, good evening. Thank you for being here. So my name is Valeria, and my project is titled Resisting Assimilation, Increasing Bicultural Identity Integration Among Immigrant Youth. I'd like to start by sharing the words of a 23-year-old named Leti. who immigrated from Venezuela to the United States at age 3. She says, quote, "I don't really identify with Hispanics that much, so it's hard for me. And I don't really identify with whites either. So I'm kind of in the middle ground, and I don't know which way to go. Over there in Venezuela, I was always la Americana, the American. And over here, I don't fit in fully either. It's really depressing. Fellow Latinos still won't fully accept me because I look white," unquote. Leti is a 1.5 generation immigrant. In the US context, 1.5 gen immigrants include those who were born outside of the United States, immigrated as children or adolescents, or completed some or all of their schooling in the States. Though being bicultural is an asset for 1.5 gen youth, it can also bring on challenges like loneliness, depression, and discrimination. Some youth may feel misunderstood, mislabeled, and challenged by others about how they identify. Because of the challenges immigrant youth face, which I've also experienced firsthand as someone who was born in Argentina and immigrated to the States as a child, I wanted my capstone project to examine existing school-based psychoeducation curricula that support the mental health of this population and help youth integrate their cultural identities. To do so, I conducted a literature search and benchmarking interviews. What I found was a curriculum developed by 2 social workers, Maggie Bishop and Galina Melamed. They developed this curriculum for middle school youth with bicultural and multicultural backgrounds. The aim of it was to increase students' bicultural identity integration. Bicultural identity integration, abbreviated as BII, is a psychological construct that captures individuals' perceptions about how harmonious and blended their 2 cultures are. In other words, does an individual feel that they can peacefully identify with both cultures and also create a blended version of their identity that combines aspects of both cultures? What's powerful about this concept, BII, is that it is positively associated with psychological adjustment. This can include greater self-esteem, life satisfaction, and family functioning, as well as less depression, anxiety, and loneliness. I had the chance to speak to Ms. Bishop and Ms. Melamed about this curriculum, and they shared about its success in increasing students' BII. They had not re-implemented the curriculum since 2015, but were interested in potentially revitalizing it. I also examined existing literature that might inform the content of a potential curriculum specific to 1.5 gen youth. One study showed that writing a positive resolution to a narrative about bicultural memory or conflict is associated with higher BII. Another study reported that immigrant youth participants requested discussions at school about discrimination and stereotyping. They also asked for help navigating communication difficulties with peers and parents. Based on my interviews and this research, I propose using Ms. Bishop and Ms. Melamed's framework as a guide to create, implement, and evaluate a school-based psychoeducation group curriculum serving 1.5 gen youth enrolled in middle school. I can speak with you about the content in more detail during the poster session. This kind of project would require a partnership between a local school district, a mental health agency, and a research institution. So why does this matter? If successful, this kind of intervention could promote the psychological adjustment associated with BII, and even contribute to long-term outcomes like preventing suicide, substance abuse, and academic struggles. These are all urgent issues for lawmakers, parents, schools, and social workers. This kind of curriculum could also be a tool to combat oppression because it provides an alternative to assimilation. If youth receive support from adults and peers to integrate their cultural identities, they won't feel as much pressure to assimilate to the dominant culture, to feel they have common sense, or to feel they're human. As US demographics change, young people's identities may become increasingly hyphenated, which means more and more youth will need help navigating and integrating their cultural backgrounds. When we support 1.5 Gen youth today, we're helping prepare them to be adults who can support future youth tomorrow. Thank you. Our next presenter is Ali Frisch.
Hi, everyone. Am I close enough? That's better. I'm too short. More? Paula. Hi, everyone. So I'm going to be talking about trauma treatment with refugee communities. And my idea for this project goes back a few years ago when I was doing refugee services in Nashville, Tennessee. And we had a program for our youth that was focused on helping them learn coping and resilience skills. So like how to identify emotions, how to know when you're triggered, and how to calm down when those things are happening. And that program was based on something called the ARC framework. And I really loved the idea and the principles behind this program, but I could tell that it wasn't really being delivered in the best way it could have been. So I decided to look deeper into the ARC framework for this project and see how it could be most useful for refugee youth and families. So I'll talk more about ARC in a little bit, but first I want to talk about why trauma services are so needed for refugee communities. So displaced individuals experience very complex and often prolonged traumas such as exposure to war and genocide, imprisonment, trafficking, sexual violence, being forced to leave their homes, and living in refugee camps. And then once they resettle, they continue to experience a lot of adversity in different ways. Poverty, separation from family members, living in and participating in systems that are unfamiliar to them, language barriers, racism, and alienation. And in refugee youth in particular, depression, anxiety, and sleep disturbance are more common in them than in the general population. And children are also experiencing these mental health challenges while adjusting to a new education system and socializing in a new country. So left untreated, children may develop conduct disorders, substance abuse, education interruption, missed social connections, legal trouble, and difficulty maintaining employment. So in identifying a good intervention to utilize, I worked from a theoretical background of attachment theory and ecological systems theory. So attachment is something with your caregiver, something that can be very affected when you or your family experiences trauma. So this is something really important in this population. And then also, refugee children and families cannot be seen in the context of just them as an individual, but in terms of the many different systems that they interact with. So the graphic on the left, which you can look at closer later, kind of shows all the different systems that these individuals are impacted by all at once and how those contribute to their mental health issues. So when looking at the needs and the theories, I determined that the ARC framework does seem pretty appropriate for this population. ARC stands for attachment, regulation, and competency. It's an evidence-based practice developed for children and adolescents with complex trauma that is designed to engage systems of support and caregivers. It addresses competencies that are frequently impacted by complex trauma, like healthy attachment, and it focuses on enhancing caregiver supports, emotion regulation and behavior issues, and enhancing resiliency. The graphic in the middle outlines more clearly specific competencies addressed at each level of this treatment. ARC has shown to be effective in a variety of areas such as reducing behavior and emotional needs, reducing trauma symptoms, and helping parents feel more confident and less stressed. So ARC to me felt most appropriate to use with refugee children and families for a variety of reasons. Firstly, it is specifically designed for victims of complex and prolonged trauma, which is common in this population. And further, one of my main concerns was identifying an intervention that incorporated family support, due to the family being the refugee youth's biggest source of support, cultural continuity, and protective factors that can help buffer from negative trauma impacts. Additionally, many cultures that these families come from are far more collective rather than individualistic as ours is. Many times families are experiencing these traumas together, and so the family can help one another process these experiences. And ARC fulfills this need by engaging parents and caregivers in treatment, by enhancing attachment with caregivers and prioritizing psychoeducation. And lastly, ARC is ideal for this population as it is designed to engage more than just the individual in treatment, but also their systems of support, such as their community or their schools. Now, the important part, while this framework is seemingly really effective and would address many of the needs that are present within refugee communities, it's likely not enough on its own to be super effective for this population. Refugee communities experience unique barriers to treatment that must be addressed and might necessitate that this model be modified in some ways. For instance, refugee parents and caregivers often are working multiple jobs or are working non-traditional hours. This would make it harder for them to go to every single session with their kid, but they still need to be involved somehow. So it might be necessary to provide services for the kid in a school setting, either after school or during lunch, and make sure that they have access to regular treatment and being able to socialize with other kids that probably have similar backgrounds and experiences to them. And then having bi-weekly or weekly in-person, on the phone, or in the home sessions with parents so that they can have check-ins while they might not be able to regularly show up to treatment. But that would form a space for them to check in, provide psychoeducation, and get them on the same board as the intervention. It's also necessary to provide translators or staff members that come from a similar cultural background. Clinicians of this model must be able to meet parents and caregivers where they're at, and clinicians need to be flexible in scheduling, as I said before. And then, in addition to all the adaptations that are necessary, cultural competency is very key to providing ARC to this population. So it's very necessary to provide training for practitioners in cultural humility, in working with individuals of different cultural backgrounds, and in the specific cultural backgrounds that the clients are coming from. It would also be ideal to have practitioners that come from the same country or the same culture as the clients. And it's also really important that practitioners understand that individuals and families that come from different cultural backgrounds likely have different ways of expressing healthy attachment, unhealthy attachment, expressing their emotions, different views or awarenesses of mental health in general, and different coping skills that would be most useful or beneficial to them specifically. Further psychoeducation needs to be explained in terms that are easy to understand and in the language that is appropriate to the client. Also, resources such as books, worksheets should provide examples and situations that are applicable to the client, rather than only applicable to white or American clientele, which so much of our resources are. So in general, it's just important to use practices that are best suited for the child and family that you're working with. And while it's super important to maintain fidelity to an intervention model, it's also vital to ensure that the model is effective for the various populations that can benefit from it. Thank you. Lastly, Kenny.
Good evening to all those joining us in person and on Zoom this evening. My capstone is going to be a slight change of pace from my wonderful colleagues' presentations. This fall of 2024, I'm entering the final fourth year of a 4-year Juris Doctorate and Masters of Social Work dual degree program. And no, please, not worth the applause. So I did not know entering law school that all the first year, we call it 1L, courses are graded on a curve with a 3.1 target mean GPA, called blissful ignorance. So what does this curve look like? 30% of students will receive some form of an A. 55% of students will receive some form of a B, and 15% of students will receive a C or worse. I was almost exclusively in those lower two tiers my 1L year. Hello, future employers. For an additional disclosure, on a serious note, I'm a person who struggled a lot with mental health from a young age, and the syllabi for our course are now instructed to read that the law school environment is one that may exacerbate pre-existing mental health issues. So when I found myself, after 1L year, locked in a relentless cycle of self-criticism, my research mind started wondering two things. One, just how pervasive are mental health issues amongst law school students, And 2, what opportunities are law schools taking to address these issues? From 2014 to 2021, the percentage of law school students screening positive for depression and anxiety nearly doubled. And in 2021, 1 in 5 law school students screened positive for post-traumatic stress disorder. And the percentage who've dealt with suicidal ideation in the past year is at 11%. That is 1 in 10 law students. Now, some of these statistics can be chalked up to increased mental health literacy, the effects of the COVID-19 period, and a rise in self-directed, self-seeking behaviors. But institutions like the ABA, on the left, have recognized the problems I've listed as long-standing within the legal community to the extent that they have put forward 3 new accreditation standards for law schools. 303B calls for professional identity formulation. This calls for conversations about what does it mean to be a lawyer and the special obligations that lawyers have to their clients and to society. 303C calls for education on bias and cross-cultural competency. That is, how do our experiences with race, religion, gender, sexual orientation, and other protected characteristics impact our practice. And 505B calls for law schools to provide information related to mental health and substance use disorders. Many of these standards can be met now through intentional orientation programming, a hands-on Dean of Student Services, and the presence of an embedded on-site counselor, which Case Western is fortunate to have. But in my opinion, 1Ls deserve a little something more. 1L is a particularly sensitive year. The first year of law school is vitally important to a student's ability to cope with the psychological stress and demands of the field, as it is for a student's case analysis and how to think like a lawyer. It's the foundation upon which good or bad habits are built for a lifelong, meaningful vocation. After speaking with 4 experts in the field, Dean Bilionis at the University of Cincinnati, Dean Jaffe at American, Jordana Cafino, who's an adjunct with Fordham Law, and Cliff Roski, who's a full-time professor at Utah, here's a brief outline of what I envision a 1L's first-year curriculum should look like. Using a bi-weekly, hour-long intervention that takes protected a block of time, this capstone process will teach 1Ls the basic tenets of positive psychology and start working with them on formulating their professional identity. All law schools have some form of a first-year 1L year-round legal writing course. Cases is aptly titled Legal Writing, Leadership, Experiential Learning, Advocacy, and Professionalism. What I think Case or any other law school should seek out to accomplish in fall and spring 1L semesters is to instill a sense of self-compassion into their new law students and nurture reflective thinking. Practically, this means that students would be able to notify their emotions without suppressing them or invalidating them. They would acknowledge their common humanity that they share with their classmates and cease gradually with the endless comparison and competition. And they would instead slowly turn to self-kindness. And in this process, they would hopefully start to grasp the frameworks guiding their thoughts and actions and be able to pursue fulfilling career choices with the intangible qualities of grit and resilience. And as a result, grow into more marketable, holistic attorneys post-bar passage that truly serve their clients. It is my hope the legal education system will get to a place where 1Ls will know that they are capable, that they have community, and that they should engage in the mental health and well-being related concerns proactively. I look forward to discussing this more with some of you at my poster session. And on behalf of Cohort 11 of the Mandel Leadership Fellows, we would like to thank the Mandel Foundation for their unwavering support of this program. In addition, we'd like to thank all of our wonderful mentors, faculty, and staff for their guidance and support over the past 2 years. This concludes our live stream session, and a deep note of gratitude to all of those who've also attended remotely through Zoom. We will now transition to the in-person poster session. Thank you.